Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this UKLFI Charitable Trust webinar on the Abraham Accords, the normalization agreements between Israel and several Arab nations, initially the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and later also Morocco and Sudan, changed the Middle East and challenged much of the received wisdom around how to achieve peace between Israel and its neighbours. Hamas documents indicate that a major objective of its attack on Israel on the 7th of October 2023 was to derail negotiations for Saudi Arabia to join the Abraham Accords between Israel and moderate Muslim states. It is said that Hamas leaders feared that these negotiations were about to reach a successful conclusion, that other Muslim states would follow the Saudis, and that the Palestinian cause would then be sidelined. The ensuing war has plainly halted progress in the negotiations with Saudi Arabia, but to the surprise of many, the agreements with the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco have remained in force, while Kazakhstan and Somaliland have recently agreed to join the accords. To discuss the framework of these international agreements and to consider their future prospects, I am delighted to be joined by Fleur Hassan-Nahoum. She currently serves as Israel's Special Envoy for Trade and Innovation. She is a Senior Fellow of the Misgov Institute for National Security, and she hosts The Quad, current affairs program on JNS TV. It's modelled on America's The View, but far superior in its analysis and entertainment value, in my opinion, and I've been privileged to join it as a guest in Jerusalem. Fleur grew up in Gibraltar, read law at King's College London, and qualified as a barrister in England and Wales. She also holds an MA from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in conflict research management and resolution. Fleur co-founded the UAE Israel Business Council in 2020 and organised the inaugural meeting of the Gulf Israel Women's Forum. She was Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem between 2018 and 2024. Ladies and gentlemen, please begin to put your questions to Fleur into the Q&A facility in Zoom, and we will address those in the discussion part of this webinar. Fleur, you have been closely involved in building on the positive dynamics created by the Abraham Accords. You are very welcome, and we look forward to the inside track and your future projections. Thank you for joining us.
Natasha, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be speaking to you. And of course, Jonathan, who conceived of this webinar. And I have to say, the incredible work that UKLFI does around the world, and you, Natasha, as an incredible voice for our country and our people. So I want to take everybody back a little bit before October 2023. And I'm going to make it a little personal because it just illustrates where we were, what we've been through, and where we're going, hopefully. So in September 2023, the foreign minister of the State of Israel invited me to become a special envoy for trade and innovation. And the reason why he asked me to do that is because we were on track to making peace normalization with Saudi Arabia. That was absolutely something that was in the near future at that point. And he called me into his office and he says to me, I want you to organize the business to business and the people to people things that you did for the UAE and for the Gulf in general. And I, of course, was thrilled. I was already considering leaving City Hall after 8 years. And this, to me, was a very positive next step in the development of the Abraham Accords, the expansion of the Abraham Accords. And in a way, it was kind of, if October the 7th wouldn't have happened, it would have at that point been game over for the radical Islamists, because once Saudi Arabia goes on the side of peace and prosperity with a view to the future, then what's really left is Qatar, who at best always hedge their bets. That would have kind of pushed them over the edge, and who knows what would have happened with Iran at that point. But of course, it wasn't in the interest of the Islamists for Saudi Arabia and Israel to normalize. And as you well said, Natasha, I'm convinced more than ever, now we have documents that prove this, that the timing of 7th of October was there in order to derail the normalization that was going on with Saudi Arabia. So bringing you back to my story. So September, I get appointed by the foreign minister. We go out on Jewish holidays, and it's just about to be my 50th birthday. And the Jerusalem Post asked me to write this long article about, I was born during the Yom Kippur War, and how 50 years later, everything's changed. And we're so far away from where we were with the Yom Kippur War. It's almost like we tempted fate. So I write this beautiful article with tons of lovely pictures of me and a lot of Emiratis and Moroccans and all of the Gulf work that I'd done with my colleagues in the UAE Israel Business Council and the Gulf Israel Women's Forum. I write this article about how different, where are we 50 years from the Yom Kippur War? The article gets published. 2 days later, I celebrate my 50th birthday. I have a party. And a week later, it's October 7th. So just so you can imagine the juxtaposition of where we were thinking, oh my God, look how far we've come from the Yom Kippur War. And we're right back there and almost worse in terms of civilian casualties, brutality, etc., and everything else that was done to us on that horrible day. And so just before that, as the special envoy and also as the co-founder of the UAE Israel Business Council, I signed an agreement under the auspices of 3 foreign ministries: the UAE Foreign Ministry, the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and the American State Department, something called the Indian Foreign Ministry, something called I2U2, which was India, Israel, UAE, USA. And it was a quadrilateral agreement that was meant to advance the Abraham Accords in a really practical way. So we were talking about Israeli technology, UAE investment, India resources and building something in India, and the USA being kind of the daddy in these accords. Again, this happened 2 weeks before October 7th. And so this was the trajectory. October 7th, everybody was shocked. The people who were as shocked as we were, by the way, were the Emiratis, because, Israel's image and the reason why people made peace with us is because we are strong. This is peace through strength, peace through the added value that Israel has in the region, technologically, defense, and of course, the fact that we share some enemies like the Islamic Republic of Iran. Let's not forget that the UAE, their biggest threat is the Muslim Brotherhood. They kicked out the Muslim Brotherhood 10, 12 years before they signed the Abraham Accords. They changed their school curriculum at least a decade before they signed the Abraham Accords. 2 years before they signed the Abraham Accords, they'd adopted this identity of tolerance. They had the Year of Tolerance where they let Israel set up a booth. That was also very momentous. And so they were kind of marching towards this. I never thought it was going to happen so fast, but it did. But they were shocked. They were shocked that Israel was caught with its pants down, essentially. They were truly shocked. And, and a lot of people, as the war began to progress, a lot of people did not think that the Abraham Accords would last. I'm talking more about the UAE because Bahrain is a much smaller country. It's a country of 1.5 million people. It's an island, which is basically attached to Saudi Arabia through a bridge. Morocco, Morocco is a country that, in terms of trade, there's a lot of potential, but it's still not in the same league as the UAE, because the UAE is it's not a huge market like Israel. It's about 10 million people. Most of them are not Emiratis. But what's interesting about the UAE is that it's a supply chain route. It's a bridge to Africa as well as the East. And so the UAE is a very important trade hub. And that's why we can talk about bigger numbers with the UAE than we can with Morocco, or certainly not Bahrain. And Sudan got into its own problems when they started a civil war shortly afterwards. So let's put them out of the story. But basically, they were shocked and they kind of stood with us at the beginning. They kind of still stood with us. Bahrain actually was the most emphatic criticism, an attack on Hamas came from the king, of Bahrain. The Emiratis also send out, their sympathies, their shock. They understand that they have the same enemy as us. But as the war progressed, the people, the Muslim street in the UAE became more and more hostile, because one of the things that didn't happen with the Abraham Accords, unfortunately, is that their media didn't really change that much. Their media was still demonizing us. Of course, not to the levels of Al Jazeera, not to the levels of the BBC, but they weren't being friendly and they certainly weren't being neutral. Ironically, the people who were pretty neutral were the Saudis with Al Arabiya. Now, Al Arabiya used to be the same as Al Jazeera. And about 4 or 5 years ago, they did an editorial turn and they decided that they weren't going to be shilling for the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is their biggest enemies. And they weren't going to be like Al Jazeera, who are also Qatar and Saudi, of course, are not friends. And of course, neither is Qatar and the UAE. Qatar and UAE had to do like a Jared Kushner had to push them together to make peace, because it was thought that if we could get Saudi to join in the peace treaties, the Qatar might be next. I mean, that's how deluded we were in 2023. And Al Arabiya also remain pretty neutral. I know that because they've interviewed me. They're not particularly friendly, but they're not particularly demonizing. I've had much worse interviews in Sky News and in BBC, as you have, Natasha. So, but Al Arabiya has always been steadily kind of, yeah, we want to hear your opinion and we're going to let you finish your point. And even though I've debated, Palestinian ambassadors here and there, it's always been a fair debate, I have to say. So the Saudis in the media stayed pretty neutral. The Saudi street went really against us because of the years of indoctrination that they really didn't have a chance to pull out of the system. They tried in the last couple of years, they took out anti-Semitism from the school curriculum, but they're still not really cleaned it out completely. It's a much more traditional society. It's also a much bigger country. It's like 70 million people. And so the Saudi street went from about 10% support from them to normalizing with us, which the king could have kind of pushed to about 5 or less percent support now. And unfortunately, the Emirati street, which is very much blinded with love, they go after their king. Whatever happens, we're with the king. He knows best. And honestly, he's turned a desert into a beautiful country, which is completely advanced. And everybody, all the Emiratis have got money and land, and the government gives them that. The street in the UAE also, we lost support there. And personally, I had a lot of very strong relationships there. Some of them have withheld, some of them write to me privately all the time. We're with you. These people are horrible. We hate them. They're bastards. And then I started seeing some people who I thought were my friends, that I'd built a relationship over 3 years, starting to share some horrible Islamist anti-Semitic stuff. So, it was a mixed bag. It was a mixed bag of the people that stuck it out with us and the people who understood from the beginning what was going on. And in Morocco, I would say, in terms of the street, in terms of the people, we didn't lose that much support, because Morocco actually, Morocco feel very proud of their Jewish history. It's a completely different country. They're actually more like Israel, I would say, than the UAE is, because UAE is all top down. Morocco is a bit more like Israel, which is, there's a lot of kind of grassroots bottom up activity. And so I used to get messages from my Moroccan friends all the time. We get you, we're with you. It's been a mixed bag there too, but they've actually been more consistent. So the UAE, they could have dropped out. A lot of people predicted they would. And if you would have asked me in 2020, when we signed those accords, if they would withstand 2 years of a regional war of the proxies of the Islamic Republic and others attacking Israel in a war that basically flattened Gaza, I don't know whether I would have said that it would have lasted. So the fact that it did is incredible. Now, this is what's even more incredible. In April 2024, we were attacked for the first time directly by the Islamic Republic of Iran. Through the night, there weren't ballistic missiles, but there were pretty horrible things that could have killed a lot of people. Now, the next day, the UAE, The next day, the UAE came out and said that they'd helped us. Now, what people have to understand is that, in the Arab world, rhetoric and reality can sometimes be two different things. We're friendly with you behind closed doors, but we're not going to take a picture with you hugging and kissing. The Abraham Accords broke that. But when the war started, for the UAE, the day after Iran attacked us, in that April, to come out and say the next day, we helped Israel repel that attack, was to me incredible. Not because they helped us, but because they admitted that they helped us. And the Saudis also admitted that they helped us. We don't even have a signed agreement with them. So, and Jordanian planes in the sky helping us. To me, that was the new Middle East that morning. And let me tell you something else. The only airline that has not stopped flying to Israel during the entire war has been Emirates Airlines and Fly Dubai, which is the same company. They have been doing multiple flights a day, sometimes less, sometimes more, but they have not stopped flying to Israel. And what's really interesting is that for many, many years, the main connecting airport for Israel to the entire world was Istanbul. And now it's 100% shift. And our main connecting airport, certainly to the east, is now Dubai, which is incredible. So they have seen the fruits of the peace with us. I don't think they've gotten enough love from the United States for them being the Nachshon, for them being the pioneers of the Abraham Accords, for them being the first country open to the criticism of the Islamic world for making peace with Israel. They never got their planes and they never got whatever it is. And now it's very interesting what's happening. Very sad, actually, what's happening. And that is that the Saudis and the Emiratis were on the same side of two other regional wars, Yemen and Sudan. And the Saudis, I don't know what happened to them. I have my theories, which I'll share in a minute. But the Saudis have done a U-turn on Yemen. Now they're supporting the Houthis, which is crazy. And in Sudan, not only are they on the opposite side of the civil war there, but they have taken, the Saudis have taken the delegitimization and demonization playbook of the Gaza war against Israel, the same playbook, and they're using it against the UAE. So in the last 6 weeks, there's been a terrible campaign in the Arab media that is funded by the Saudis, instructed from above from the Saudis against the UAE. And of course, the main thing they say is, look, you're in the pockets of the Jews, you're in the pockets of Israel, and all of this. Now, they must be a little bit dim, the Saudis, because they somehow thought that they would be involved in a delegitimization campaign against the UAE in Arabic, and nobody would translate it, and it wouldn't get to the media anywhere else in the world, except that, of course, it did. And all of a sudden, their anti-Semitism in Arabic was exposed. And all of a sudden, all the Jewish money that they're expecting to invest in their country, which, by the way, is having some economic issues, all of a sudden the Jews are, hang on a minute, what's going on here? And all of a sudden, the Saudi ambassador in Washington was talking to the Jewish community, calming them down and telling them that nothing had changed. But to me, the barometer is always the press. And when the press changes, especially when the press in a country that doesn't have freedom of speech is coming from above, when that's changing, you know there's been instructions. And I haven't been invited on Al Arabi English for a while, so I take that as a sign as well. But that's what's happening with the geopolitical situation with potentially Saudi, what's going on with the UAE. But let me just, end my part of this with some encouraging numbers, okay? 2022, we finished the year with $2.5 billion in trade, goods, and services. 2023, it was at 3 billion. Okay, you could say, okay, it's only the last quarter of 2023 where we were at war and it wasn't what's happened in Gaza through 2024. But 2024, the numbers went up to $3.3 billion, which means that the war in its, most ferocious moments did not affect trade. So maybe people weren't taking pictures with their Emirati friends, and we weren't, all flying to Dubai and doing parties like we did in 2020, 21, and 22. I was very much a part of that scene of cultural events, and music events, and business events, tourism events. I was one of those people always flying in, and they were flying here, and that was going on. But even without all of that, we finished 2024, $3.3 billion. Okay. 2025, $4.3 billion we finished the year, and the war only finished in October. And what's even more incredible is that they just recently, a couple of months ago, the Emiratis signed a huge deal with Elbit for defense technology, drones, $2.3 billion. It's an 8 to 10-year contract. 600 Israeli companies are working there. And I want to remind everyone that when some foreign nationals kidnapped and killed a Chabad rabbi, those 3 foreign nationals were put to death. When NYU Abu Dhabi, when they had their graduation and some guy goes on stage to get his diploma with a kafir and said free Palestine, within 10 hours, he was deported and on a plane out of the country. And so, yes, it may have gone a little cold. And yes, I lost some friends, but they signed a strategic long-term agreement and they're sticking to it. And I just wrote an article 2 days ago in the Hebrew media saying, let's show them some love because they need it. They've been abandoned by what they thought were their friends. There was always a healthy competition between the UAE and Saudi, but MBZ, the leader of the UAE, was very much a mentor to MBS. He's an older man. He opened the doors to trade. He really has the best country in the Arab world. He's a real example of what the Arab world could look like if you do the right things for your people without even having to be a democracy. And MBS has betrayed him. They feel very betrayed. And this is our moment to take this into an opportunity to warm up or re-warm up ties with the Emiratis. What will happen? I'll just say a couple of words on Saudi and Iran. One of the reasons that I can think of, I can analyze why Saudi have kind of turned against the UAE and turned against us in the last few weeks or months is because they're really scared of a free Iran. On the one hand, they want a weak Iran, but I'm not sure they want to lose their status as the big fish in the region. The minute Iran is free, Iran now becomes not only Israel's best friend, because let's be honest, we've done the heavy lifting here, because the Persian people love us, because they admire Netanyahu as a strong leader. The minute that happens, then the Saudi oil is less valuable because now we have endless amounts of crude oil from Iran, and they're now not the biggest show in town. And I believe that that's one of the reasons why they're going, ooh, maybe a free Iran, maybe a liberal America-centric Iran is not the best thing for our interests. I actually think they're being extremely short-sighted for thinking this way. And I'm telling whoever will listen to me over there any opportunity I get.
Fleur, thank you so much for that overview. The questions have already been streaming in. The facts and figures that you more or less concluded with seem to give a new meaning to James Carville's famous phrase, "It's the economy, stupid."
Thank
And
you.
that perhaps leads me to a couple of questions that I wanted to start with that drill down on what sort of agreement these Abraham Accords were in the first instance. There's lots of discussion of the trade that predated these agreements, the people-to-people peace that existed before that was formalized. So I'd love to understand a little better what your impression of those agreements in the first instance was. One of the questions we've had from the audience perhaps goes to this point also. They say Professor Moshe Sharon once told me that the peace agreements with Jordan and Egypt are based on mere armistice agreements. Why should the Abraham Accords be different? Perhaps are the Abraham Accords different? And what is your assessment of the nature of those agreements been?
Sure, I'll correct you. There was zero people-to-people relationship before the accords were signed, but there was business. So there were estimated about 200 to 300 Israeli companies for a number of years before the accords were signed, working, white labeling the product so that it wouldn't be made from Israel. I have a friend actually who she had a medical, a special bandage for women. She was selling in the UAE, and she said she had a warehouse in the UAE where they were just covering the made in Israel stickers. And that's how she was able to sell. So before the accords were signed, there was zero people-to-people. There was a little bit of business going on. After they were signed, they were certainly never envisioned. So I'll say it like this. When they were signed, I don't think the signatories understood how much of a people-to-people peace it would become. I definitely think that the intention was the opposite of what happened with Egypt. And I agree with whoever asked the questions about Egypt and Jordan. The difference is that the Egypt and Jordan peace with Israel remained at the top, remained military, diplomatic, and political. It never became people to people. Never at all. You would never see Egyptian tourists walking around Jerusalem. There was nothing going on which was people to people. Now, you could say, well, we actually had wars. There was bloodshed with these people, and maybe that was the difference. But when the Abraham Accords were signed, it was intended to be a warmer peace. That's for sure. But I don't think it was ever envisioned to be as warm as it was. There was an incredible energy about these accords. People were so excited, were so curious about one another. I used to get a million questions about Judaism. How do you do this? And we do that. And once I was on a panel with very, very talented UAE ambassador to Washington, Yusuf Al-Utaiba. And he said, when we signed, yes, we wanted a warm peace. If you were to ask me whether I envisioned that there was going to be baseball little league from Israel coming to visit the UAE, I would have said never. And that's where it was going. We had sports, and we had and music festivals, and we had art projects, and I had my women's council. We did in 2022, 21, we did a Holocaust Remembrance Day in the UAE. I mean, that's crazy to think that that could have happened. My friend Ahmed Al-Mansouri has a museum there called Crossroads of Civilization, which was he had it before the Abraham Accords. He had a little thing called the Holy Land because he didn't want to call it Palestine, he didn't want to call it Israel, Holy Land. And then in 2022, he decided to open up a Holocaust exhibition, a permanent exhibition in his museum. That was never envisioned by the people signing the agreements. But they did envision something warmer than with Egypt and Jordan. But what's really curious about the peace with Egypt and Jordan is that after the Abraham Accords were signed, they started to feel FOMO. For those of you who don't know what FOMO is, fear of missing out. And all of a sudden, trade also went up with Jordan, and trade also went up with Egypt. And all of a sudden, Egypt now wanted a direct flight, which they never wanted before. So the FOMO was really an incredible thing that we also experienced.
I'm glad to hear the reference to FOMO. I believe that that began as an English phrase, and I have to say I was a little concerned with your reference to MBZ. I might have to
Oh,
insist that
sorry, I'm
I
sorry.
might have to insist you spend a bit more
Sorry,
time in the United
I'm
Kingdom
sorry. I
instead.
correct my children every time they say garbage, so shame on me.
Um, well, this is fascinating. We've had a lot of questions that I want to delve into in terms of the intricacies of relationships within the region.
Yeah.
But one questioner remarks on the success of the Abraham Accords and says it doesn't fit with the narrative of the pro-Palestinian supporters and protesters, the UN, and a selection of world governments. So, what are the objections and material actions these factions are likely to initiate if the Saudis sign up in the near future? I can certainly appreciate that the worldview of many of these individuals, which perhaps mirrors that of Secretary of State John Kerry. I don't know if you recall the
Oh,
2016
yeah.
Sabban conference and
I
his
spent 2 years just telling everyone how stupid he was.
For the
Yeah.
benefit of our audience, his words at that conference were, "Mark my words, there will never be a separate peace between Israel and the Arab world without the resolution of the Palestinian issue," or something to that effect. And of course, the Abraham Accords made that worldview look, frankly, very silly. This
Yeah.
questioner is highlighting, though, this tension between the perspectives of the West, uh,
Mm.
for the most part that we see on the streets in university campuses in the form of these protests,
Yeah.
and the reality on the ground in the Middle East.
Well, first of all, I'm glad you brought that up. The paradigm was broken. That's what the Abraham Accords did. It basically said to the world, the Palestinian leadership are being rejectionists, and they're not going to hold the whole of the region hostage because they can't get their act together and decide to move forward with Israel. Remember that Trump in his first administration had presented this peace to prosperity plan. The Palestinians were urged to be part of that. Of course, as they usually do, they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. They said no. And they weren't part of it. And then the 2 or 3 business people from Ramallah or here and there that showed up to that famous Bahrain conference, Peace to Prosperity, when they got home, they were completely sidelined and attacked. Now, you're asking me about the world. I don't think the world is smart enough to even know what the UAE is, to understand how the Muslim Brotherhood are a threat to the Sunni moderate monarchies, or they even know anything at all, Natasha. You're giving them too much credit because you don't have to look as far as the UAE. You can say, well, Jordan and Egypt have peace with Israel. Uh, you know, so and I always say, and this is something I always say in the media, every single Arab country that has wanted peace with Israel has found peace with Israel. Now, that's how I have to dumb it down so people understand what I'm talking about. It doesn't matter. You know that facts don't affect these people who have a built-in hatred. They just have something called confirmation bias. You hit them with facts and they go, no, they use the facts the other way. So they did break the paradigm, and this is why the Saudi normalization would have broken them, would
Mm.
have broken that argument completely. And that is why Hamas and the Islamic Republic of Iran and Hezbollah and everyone else, that's why they had to do whatever they had to do. And that's why October 7th happened when it happened.
There are quite a few questions directed on Saudi Arabia. Perhaps I can
Sure.
combine a few of them. One asks, how do you think the Saudis can be redirected to the Abraham Accords? A number of concerns that a regime change in Iran might, in fact, make the Saudis less inclined to join the Abraham Accords. Of course, Iran has been a major push factor, pushing Saudi Arabia more towards Israel in opposition to it.
Yeah.
And also, what about the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Turkey? Is that a potential hurdle to future normalization?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest hurdle to future normalization with the Sunni moderates are the Sunni extremists. And the Sunni extremists, even though they wear suits, are Turkey and Qatar. So that is the major, real strategic obstacle to the extension of the Abraham Accords with Saudi Arabia. And I just want to say that a few years ago, I speculated that Indonesia would also jump on board. They're not Arabs, but they are the largest Muslim country in the world. And Indonesia were even showing signs of that at the UN a couple of months ago when the guy said shalom and everybody got very excited. If Saudi doesn't give them the nod, they won't do it. They're too dependent on the kind of the Muslim father, ruler of the holy sites. But ironically, half of Indonesia does want normalization with Israel, the other half just, fundamentalists. But I think it is right. I think that whatever happens with Iran will definitely affect it. But on the other hand, I think that if Iran falls, Saudi will have no choice but to join this side. What are they going to do? They're going to go against America. And even Qatar, they're going to go now against America. I just think that this is why this conflict with the Islamic Republic is so crucial. Because once, please God, we bring them down, then they've lost their kind of fundamentalist vortex, the center. They won't have that anymore. And Saudi won't become that because the Wahhabis, who are the Muslim Brotherhood fundamentalists in their country, they're the biggest threat to the monarchy. You have to understand, the fundamentalists don't want a monarchy. The fundamentalists want to rule themselves. They want to be the rulers. The monarchies stand in their way. So I just think that if Iran falls, I pray when they do, that the Saudis will just figure out that there's no other way for them to go. I mean, I guess if I'm being pessimistic, they could join some type of alliance with Turkey and Qatar, and cause problems. Again, it's very simple. There's countries that want peace and prosperity. Prosperity is a big one. Saudi has a plan. It's called Vision 2030. And their main problem with Saudi Arabia is that they have a very young population, which is very unskilled. So the whole point of the Vision 2030 is to make their country a technological player. And that's why they needed Israel. And I have to say that there's 200 to 300, the same way as we had companies in the UAE before we signed with them. There's also Israeli companies right now, white labeling through Bahrain their products and building their smart cities. So Saudi has a bit of a money crunch at the moment, and the money crunch might get worse if we have a free Iran selling the rest of us oil. It's a good question. I'm not sure which way it's going to go, to be honest. I really am not.
And to add something else into that mix, then someone else asked, what about Oman, which has, of course, hosted these indirect recent US-Iran talks?
Yeah, at one point I had hopes that Oman was going to come after Bahrain. I don't know why. I met in Dubai, I met the son of one of the Omani leaders who'd been killed. He was so friendly. They were all so nice. And I really thought, Jared Kushner talks about it in his book, that he met the Omanis. There's a lot of, as you know, bravado and posturing in the Arab world about them being the guardians of the Palestinians and all this and all that. I don't know. I understand now that Oman has to wait for Saudi and they can't do this decision alone. What I do know is that the last country to ever join the Abraham Accords will be Kuwait, because apparently they're virulently anti-Semitic there. They just hate us.
Well, perhaps that links to the next question I was going to pose, which is, while the Abraham Accords have opened remarkable opportunities, are there potential risks or unintended consequences, specifically for Israel, that policymakers should be mindful of as the agreements continue to expand?
Look, there was a report a couple of weeks ago in some newspaper that in terms of the Gaza the day after, they were considering having the UAE as the administrators. I don't see the UAE doing that, but I wish they would, because they took a desert, they turned it into an incredible country, technology. They're still Muslims, they're still very traditional, but they moved away from fundamentalism. Ironically, I don't know whether you all saw this, but basically the UAE have stopped giving scholarships to their kids going to study in the UK because they're scared they're going to be radicalized in the UK.
That was quite big news in the UK.
Yeah, well, I don't blame them. I would have the same concern. So So I don't know if there's any risks. I don't know if there's any risks. If an Arab country is brave enough to stand on the White House lawn, shake hands with Israel, and make peace, and then make peace good by doing this trade. We don't have trade like numbers like this in such a short time with any country. It's really incredible, the trade numbers that we have with the UAE, and we have also a trade agreement with them, which is something that we don't have with the UK at the moment. It was put on hold. So I mean, I don't know what risks I could think of. I don't think they're going to pretend they support Hamas or support Hamas. The fact that maybe we're getting involved in family rivalries here between Saudis and the UAE. I don't know if it's a risk for us at all. So maybe I'm just overly optimistic, but I don't see any risks at the moment in terms of countries that are willing to sign up and move forward with us with the Abraham Accords.
Well, in that case, building on the existing benefits, one questioner asks how the Abraham Accords can be more deeply embedded via economic, educational, cultural pathways. For instance, which officers may we solicit if we're to help build the relationship, including in places like Somaliland or Sudan?
Well, there was at the time, I think it was in 2021, there was talk of a common wealth fund, that each country was going to put, I can't remember now, tens of millions of dollars and create this wealth fund, joint wealth fund. That never happened. I think actually the fundamental problem between Israel and the UAE, which I've experienced myself, is that everything there, like I said, is top down and everything here is bottom up. So when I co-founded the UAE Israel Business Council, the ambassador of the UAE in Israel kept going to the government going, isn't there a government business council? And the government would go, no, we don't do that. There's one right there. Speak to Fleur. They'd be like, no, it has to come from the government. They'd be like, we don't do that. So that was always a little bit of an issue, but we solved that issue when we all signed that agreement with the different business council. I do think that we have to strike while the iron's hot. And if we now have a peace deal with Somaliland, I was very disappointed that the UAE didn't recognize them the next day, that America is still dilly-dallying. I had hopes that at least the countries that understand the strategic reason that we did this, especially with what's going on with Somalia, would have jumped. We started the domino effect. It didn't happen, and maybe it will, especially as Sudan and the UAE and Sudan and the Saudi rift deepens. It may happen. But I'm a practical person. I think that you don't need too much. You just need to start talking to these people, to start flying in, to start bringing delegations, trade delegations, to show them a little bit of respect, to invite them here, make them feel good, and then the market will do its job. These are strategic partners for all sorts of trade and other reasons. Free trade agreements always help. The UAE, the first thing that they did is that their sovereign wealth fund, when we made peace with them, their sovereign wealth fund invested $1 billion in our gas fields. Now that is basically the UAE making a commitment to Israel's energy future. And I will add one thing that I forgot to talk about, which is looking more unlikely now, but you never know, is that in the last couple of years, what's been in focus in terms of regional infrastructural project is something called the IMEC corridor, which is India, Middle East. I can't remember what the C is for. India, Middle East. I can't remember. But basically, it's connecting India to through the Middle East, Jordan, Israel, and then the Israeli port to be the main hub for trade going from. Did you lose me?
No, I think the sea is corridor, the India Middle East
corridor. That's right,
corridor. Yeah.
China? No, that was the whole point. So basically, it's the corridor that goes from India, Middle East through Jordan, Israel, and then into Europe. And that would be basically a way of connecting the East and the West. That's very much where the American government has been focused. I did a briefing with the Foreign Affairs Committee in Congress about this. They're very engaged in this. And, Israel's not a signatory, but Israel is a partner. And so I think it's very important to keep pushing for us to be a signatory. There were some doubts about Jordan's infrastructural capabilities, but I definitely think that we can bridge the gap and move that forward. But again, Saudi is the problem right now.
One questioner, Fleur, asks about UN Security Council Resolution 2803, which, of course, is quite recent from November last year, endorsing the comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict, which was initiated by Donald Trump. I should say our next webinar on the 1st of March with Anne Hertzberg of NGO Monitor is, in fact, on Trump's Board of Peace legal framework and implications. So I'll ask our audience to watch out for the advertising on that in due course. But of course, there has been discussion of the UAE and others being involved in implementing the 20-point plan and the future Gaza peace plan. So how do you see that interaction between the Abraham Accords and these steps to secure and ultimately de-radicalize and rebuild Gaza?
Well, what I always say is that the Emiratis de-radicalize their societies, and MBS started trying to de-radicalize his country, which is something that Egypt never did. Egypt never de-radicalized its country. I mean, they're still fighting with the Salafists, which is basically the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, they hate Hamas and everything, but their media is virulently anti-Semitism. Their education system is very anti-Semitic. So Egypt never really properly de-radicalized their societies. And the UAE did. So when people ask me, oh, how do you de-radicalize Gaza? I'm thinking, well, why don't we speak to the people who already managed to do this? The UAE. There's a lot of dodgy actors on that Board of Peace, as you know. And as in any company or in any nonprofit, you have the board that is the executive board that does the work, and then you have the board, which is the symbolic board, where you put people who are important to make your organization or your company look good, right? We all know that. So my question has been, and I was interviewed on this recently, is what executive power, do this Board of Peace have? Now, I think there's a few things going on here. I'm not sure the Board of Peace is exclusively about Gaza. I think it's a lot of people believe that Trump is just trying to stick it to the UN and create an alternative UN leadership with countries that will kiss the ring to the US. And that's what the Board of Peace is about. I think that's what a lot of people believe. And the first project is Gaza. So a lot of people believe that's what's really going on. When you look at the executive board of the Board of Peace, you have essentially, I don't think you have any, well, you have one Israeli, but he's like an American real estate guy. You have very practical people, real estate people. That's what you got. Real estate people, administrators. I have a friend, Aryeh Lightstone, Rabbi Aryeh Lightstone, who's chief of staff, senior advisor to David Friedman, and now he's in charge of the Board of Peace and the facilitation of that with Kushner and Witkoff. That gives me some type of calm that he's involved, and that this is the executive board and that the symbolic board, Turkey and Qatar, won't have too much of a say. But you don't know. You just don't know at this point. And look, the 20-point plan, if it was actually being implemented, would be fantastic. But it isn't, because Hamas are not going to disarm. A scorpion can't stop being a scorpion, just like the Iranian Islamic regime is not going to stop doing their nuclear ballistic missiles and filing its proxies. It's their raison d'etre. Why would they do that?
Shifting focus somewhat to the West, there have been a number of different manifestations of this question, but as far as I'm concerned, this one I think articulates it the best. Given the hostility to Israel and anti-Semitism of Western governments such as the UK, Canada, France, etc., do we need an equivalent of the Abraham Accords for the West?
I think the West has got its own problems, honestly, and I don't think it's up to us to solve it. We've got our own problems here. I think that uh, I think the West is just going to decide whether they're going to march towards suicide or save themselves. And I don't think they've decided yet. I really don't. You see some Eastern European countries. Last week, I hosted a group of 15 education ministers for a conference on education and AI in Israel. Most of them were Eastern European countries. They love us, and the Germans, of course. So the Germans sent 8 ministers because every region in Germany has its own educational department. Hungary, Serbia, and Kosovo, and all these countries sent, Poland, all these countries sent their representatives. A couple of Latin American countries, a couple of Cambodia and Vietnam. So these are countries that came. There was the head of the OECD for education. He came as well. And you think, why is France or Spain, UK, or any other one of these countries interested in education and AI? Of course, I'm sure they are, but God forbid, they should come to Israel and talk to one of the most advanced countries in the OECD about something we know something about, which is AI and technology. Why would they do that? They do that because they are now overtly hostile towards Israel, even though, ironically, the EU still has one of the biggest trade agreements with an outside EU country with us. So I would love to think about that, but we got enough problems here. And the West, or certainly Western Europe, has got to decide what its fate is going to be.
And outside of Western Europe, you've been asked, Fleur, for your thoughts on the potential expansion of the Abraham Accords also outside of the Arab world. For example, Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan. What do you see as potential?
Well, we signed, well, I think Trump pushed in Kazakhstan into the Abraham Accords, even though we've had diplomatic relations with Kazakhstan. Actually, we're very friendly with Azerbaijan. We have trade with them. Don't want to get into what the trade is, but we have trade with them. It's mainly defense. Armenia, by the way, they're another ones who sent ministers here last week. And so a lot of these countries that are Muslim countries, we already have really good relations. One of the most interesting countries is Albania because they are a Muslim country. They're a Muslim secular country. They love Israel. They're building a Jewish museum, and they're the only country in Europe that had more Jews after the Holocaust than before the Holocaust. The president was here. I think he was in the conference you attended, Natasha. And I've met him. I've had a steak dinner with him. He's just fantastic. The ambassador's amazing. She's a good friend of mine. They're a curious country, Albania. Again, sometimes you need the Muslims who understand what Islamic fundamental looks like to be able to tell everyone else, listen, this is not good news for anyone. Sometimes it's these Muslim countries that are not fundamental that are the best leaders in basically telling the world what they should be wary of. So look, it's almost like farcical to say that the Abraham Accords will be expanded to countries that we already have peace, diplomacy, and trade with. The only country I would say that would be relevant with is Indonesia.
So, actually, a few questions have been asked on Indonesia. It has signed a trade agreement with Israel. And so the question is, how does it fit into all of this? And also, what will the effect of Indonesian troops operating in Gaza be?
I don't see any of these people sending troops, honestly. I would feel very sorry for them if they did. But I don't, I mean, again, Indonesia's new president is open to a peace with Israel. I think he's just waiting for the nod from Saudi. Bahrain would never have made peace with Israel if they hadn't had the nod from Saudi. And Saudi's not giving nods at the moment. So we'll have to see what happens with that. I honestly do think the way that we saw that kind of sometimes trade and business precedes the actual formal agreement. I'm always a big believer that we should, we shouldn't be too proud. And if people want to trade with us, even before they have diplomatic agreements, I think we should go for it. I think it's a smart strategic thing to do.
And while we're jumping around the world, we've had a few questions on the influence of the Russian Federation and how you think Russia might factor in to this framework.
So we didn't talk about the two big elephants in the room, which is Russia and China.
Mm.
And they're very much in the background of everything, of what's going on with Iran and what's going on in Saudi. And it's just incredible to me that the hypocrisy of the Europeans were buying Russian oil through India, which was just discovered a couple of weeks ago. They're funding both sides of the Ukrainian-Russia war, which is it's beggars belief. Russia is very much in tune with Iran. They don't want the fall of the Islamic Republic because once they fall, then they lose their leverage with the biggest country, with the biggest oil producer, or not producer, oil, crude oil in the region. So they're pushing for negotiations, and they're very selfish because they don't want the regime to fall. And the same with China. But one of the biggest motivators of Trump, of course, is to bring the world away from Chinese trade and bring it more towards America. That's why the Israel India Middle East corridor is so crucial for America because that pulls Saudi and India, especially India, away from Russia and China, especially China. So again, these are very bad influences that are working behind the scenes to make sure that Iran or the Iranian Republic, the Iranian regime doesn't fall, unfortunately. And of course, that affects everything.
There have been quite a number of references to the visit of the Prince of Wales to Saudi currently. That has caused some controversy here in the United Kingdom, or at least on the BBC. But that monarchy to monarchy connection has been remarked upon, and perhaps relatedly to that, one of the questioners asks how secure you think these autocracies are. So, in the case perhaps of Morocco, they have a long history with their monarchy, as does the UK. But aren't there increasing numbers of the young generation who are open to being radicalized via the internet? Even if autocratic rulers have total control of their universities and can stop their young from perhaps being sent to the UK for fear of indoctrination, what about other forms of radicalization across the populations, even if the governments may have signed up to the Abraham Accords?
That's a problem Saudi have, you see. The UAE have less of a problem, and I'll tell you why. They really love their leader. I've never seen anything like it. It's also a very small population. There's 9 million people in the UAE, but only 1.2 or 1.3 million Emiratis. The rest are all expats. There's 3 million Indians, for God's sake. So that's the UAE. I would say that I've never seen control as I've seen in the UAE. When I went there for the first time, this guy says to me very proudly, he says, Fleur, on Thursday, the government sends all the imams the sermon for Friday. The Dvar Quran, Dvar Torah, is curated every week. That's how tight a control they have on the religious radicalization of their society. And it's a small society. So I'm not worried for the UAE. Qatar are radicalized themselves. So what do they care? They already have 330,000 people in their kingdom, and it's run by a bunch of radicals. So they're already gone. Nobody's going to move them out of the way. Saudi's a problem. This is why I'm very surprised that MBS has made this U-turn, because he really has to understand that the major threat to his monarchy are these young, radicalized, semi-communist, young Islamists. I think he knows that. He's flung so many in jail. So that's why I'm finding it hard to understand his motivation at this point. But I'm not fearful for the UAE. Bahrain is touch and go, absolutely. During the Arab Spring, it was really touch and go for Bahrain. We had to go in and rescue them, I think. The West, America mainly. They have the Fifth Fleet sitting there. In there's many more Shias in Bahrain than there are in the UAE, which is mainly Sunni. So Bahrain definitely are at risk, but so Saudi.
Mm. Fleur, there are many, many questions which I'm sorry I'm not going to get to because we are on the hour, including in relation to the sheikhs of Hebron who've also
Uh,
asked to join the Abraham Accords. But perhaps I can end by asking you this question from the audience, which is what the diaspora can do to advocate for and strengthen the Abraham Accords. Any tips that you can offer our audience in our final minutes?
So, when the Abraham Accords were at the height of their popularity, we kept seeing all these caucuses pop up in different European countries. I was part of a number of webinars actually with NGO Monitor, who are your guests next week, about the European Parliament's adopting kind of more Abraham Accord friendly policies. The only country that is investing in the Abraham Accords in Europe is Germany. Surprise, surprise. They've really put their money where their mouth is. They constantly have events. They constantly keep talking about it. So I guess what I would say is keep talking about it. Don't let it die. And any opportunity we have, especially those of you who have influence in Parliament and House of Lords, we can do to do special sessions, and let's just let's beat them at their own game. Let's keep it in the rhetoric, because the Abraham Accords proves that the only rejectionists of peace are the radicals, and we have to keep banging at that drum.
Well said. And let's hope that we'll be able to have a future follow-up session to talk about exciting developments and the expansion of the Abraham Accords. Fleur, it's been a pleasure to have.
Amen.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much for being with
Natasha.
us.
Thank you.